Hello, welcome to our study. Remember, on Wednesdays we are studying Holy Ground, or if you prefer, meeting God. And today we want to talk about meeting God at the wine press. You know, when I told my associate Derek Broom what the title of this lesson was, he laughed out loud and he said, I think I know what you're talking about, but boy, what an interesting title. And yet, there it is. It's exactly that way. We're going to see it together as we look at the book of Judges. Notice, beginning in Judges chapter 6, verse 1, that God's people have been wicked again. And as a result of that, God is punishing them. So, this is what we learn. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel because of the Midianites. The children of Israel made for themselves the dens, the caves, and the strongholds which are in the mountains. So it was, whenever Israel had sown, Midianites would come up, also Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. Then they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number, and they would enter the land to destroy it. It is a terrible description. You would hate to live under those circumstances. They couldn't even stay in their houses. They actually had to move up into caves and places like that in the ravines. They're just trying to stay out of sight of the Midianites. And that is the background for what's going on here. Their herds were so large, so numerous, that it was like locusts all over the land, and they were devouring everything in sight. God then directed a prophet to go to his people, and we pick up on that beginning at verse 6 of Judges chapter 6. So Israel was greatly impoverished because the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And it came to pass, when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet to the children of Israel, who said to them, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you out of the house of bondage. And I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you, and gave you their land. Also, I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But you have not obeyed my voice. This prophet, this spokesman of God, is letting the people know, here is why this is happening to you. God took care of you. He delivered you in the past, but you did not honor him. And because of that, they were suffering. Suffering, no doubt about it. And so, beginning verse 11 of chapter 6, we meet the major character of the next several chapters. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. A couple of things we want to observe here. First of all, it's the angel of the Lord that comes to him. Now, Gideon at first does not realize that, and we'll see that in just a moment. But as he comes to him, Gideon is in a wine press, and he's threshing the wheat. Now, that's not really the best translation. The word literally means he's beating it. People that didn't have a whole lot of money, and you see this in the book of Ruth, for instance, when they didn't have a whole lot of money, they would take the wheat and they would beat it with a stick so that the grain would fall, and they would be able to gather that up and they would be able to eat it. Now, why do that in a wine press? And the easy answer, it seems to me, and to many that I've read, is that at this time of year, there wouldn't be any wine. And so the Midianites are not going to look there to find the grain that Gideon has grown and that he's going to feed his father and his family with. So likely that's what's going on here. So in the very next verse, after that, the angel of the Lord has said, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." Remember, Gideon doesn't know who this is. In fact, we hear it. Gideon said to him, "Oh, my Lord." Now, when Kyle looked at this, he said that the word that here is translated Lord is not really the word normally that would be for Lord. This is more nearly a word for a man. It's a respectful saying, and it would be better translated something like this: Sir, sir, not recognizing him as greater than he is because he really doesn't know who it is. As far as he can tell, it's just a man. So go back. Gideon said to him, "Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." Why has everything happened to us like it has if God's with us? And Gideon acknowledges something very, very important here. He says, God delivered our people in the past, but he also knows that God has promised, in a terrible way, I guess you'd say, that if the people didn't live up to what he wanted, that he would leave them, that he would abandon them. And that is exactly what Gideon seems to see here as he looks at it, that they have been abandoned because of their unfaithfulness. It's something God had promised, but that's what Gideon feels, and maybe even been thinking about that while he's working in the wine press. I don't know about you, but when I'm doing repetitious work, my mind seems to constantly be at work on something and not often on the work that I'm doing. Well, listen to the answer. And by the way, notice he called him sir, but then he said, if the Lord is with us, and there's the word YHWH. It's the word that most often is translated Jehovah in many, many translations. So this is the Lord God that he is asking about. So verse 14, then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" All right. Notice the angel of the Lord first sat and watched Gideon as he worked. But now observe that the Lord turns and speaks to him. So what are we concluding? The same thing that we saw in the case of Moses at the burning bush and Joshua before the battle of Jericho. We're seeing that the angel of the Lord is equal to God, or Jehovah, if you prefer. Now, Gideon's question is a bit disturbing, I suppose, to us, because the question seems to carry with it, almost a rebuke of God. But I want to remind all of us that there are different ways to ask a question. And you can actually go to Luke chapter 1 and see both of those. You've got Zacharias, who when he questions God, or questions God's angel in that case, when he questions, he's caused to be mute. He's unable to speak for the next 9 months. And in contrast to that, when Mary asks a question, she is honored. She's given an answer, and she's told that she's being honored among women, and here's why. Now, when the Lord turned, the words that are used here are different. This idea here is the Lord himself, Jehovah. This is not just the angel of the Lord, who, by the way, I believe is Jehovah. I believe it's the pre-incarnate Jesus that we're looking at. But beyond that, now Gideon's going to realize it. And so look at verse 15. So he said to him, "O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." So now all of a sudden, he turns from that demonstration of strength. And by the way, Kyle, when he looked at that, go back to verse 14 just briefly. Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours." And Kyle said that word translated "this" here is points to a strength. It is demonstrative of the strength that had been given to him through the promise of God. So it's not a strength he had already, it's a strength that God gave him and that he's going to be able to use. Well, then Gideon now knows who he's talking to, and so he doesn't call him sir anymore. Instead, he uses the word Adonai, and this word is always used as a proper name to describe God, and that's what you find in the Hebrew English lexicons. And so Gideon now knows who he's talking to, and he directs his discussion in a different way. He doesn't challenge God by questioning, but instead he says, I'm not much of a fella. I'm from a very small tribe and a very small family within that tribe, and I'm really basically a small man within a small family, within a small tribe. And so how in the world are you going to deliver by me? He doubts his own abilities, in other words, which is not what we saw previously. So verse 16, and the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." A powerful testimony. First of all, I will be with you. And that's a message that is heard again and again from great men of faith in the Bible. Either they say it or it is said to them. If God's on our side, how can we lose? That's the big question. Who can really stand against God? Romans 8:31 asks the question. We need to remember that, even in difficult times, which we may feel that we are having right now, even in difficult times, it is imperative for us to remember that with God on our side, we can win the victory. There is no doubt about it. We can win the victory, and we need to realize that. So God goes on and says, you're going to defeat this massive army as if it were just one man. Now, I want to remind you of the great promises God had made. As long as he's with them as they enter the promised land, he said one Israelite will chase 1,000 men. And you're getting a little taste of that here. If God's on your side, then the victory is assured. So, verse 17, then he said to him, "If now I found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you." And he said, "I will wait until you come back." Well, the word translated offering literally could be translated sacrificial gift. He's going to bring a sacrificial gift to him, which implies worship. Now, if this is a regular angel, we see in the book of Revelation, he should not have accepted worship, but it is not a regular angel. It is the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ, as we've already mentioned. So go ahead. The angel Lord is waiting, just like he said. In verse 19, so Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot. And he brought them out to him under the terebinth tree and presented them. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth." And he did so. And then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Well, he accepted this sacrificial gift very clearly, and by doing so, he indicated exactly who he was. Gideon now knows he's been in the presence of God. Now, there's a little bit of a shock effect that's involved in that. And so, verse 22, we find now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, "Alas, O Lord God, for I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face." And he's probably remembering what was said through Moses, how that no man could see God face to face and live. And he realizes, because of the way the sacrifice was received, the sacrificial gift, that this is God. But then we hear, then the Lord said to him, "Peace be with you. Do not fear. You shall not die." So don't worry about it. This has happened exactly the way that it is supposed to happen. So then we proceed, and we hear in verse 24, "So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, 'The Lord is Peace.' To this day, it is still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites." Now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, "Take your father's young bull, the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement, and take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down." So he's recognized that he saw God. He's already, as we see here, he has already called this place a place of peace, because God told him the peace would be with him. And now God gives him instructions. You tear down the altar of Baal. And now the description he gives there is of a wooden object. Probably this was an Asherah. And he's told to cut that down too, and use the Asherah to burn the second bull as a sacrifice to the Lord. And so verse 27, "So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as the Lord had said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night." So he went ahead and did exactly what God told him to do. And then we find, beginning verse 28, an interesting thing that transpires. And Gideon actually gets a new name, and it is a name significantly enough that we more often hear used of Gideon from this point forward. But listen to what it says. "When the men of the city rose early in the morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image that was beside it was cut down. And the second bull was being offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, 'Who has done this thing?' And when they had inquired and asked, they said, 'Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing.' Then the men of the city said to Joash, 'Bring out your son, that he may die, because he's torn down the altar of Baal, and because he's cut down the wooden image that was beside it.' But Joash said to all who stood against him, 'Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down.' Therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, 'Let Baal plead against him, because he has torn down his altar.'" Now the point, it seems to me, is clear. If Baal's really a god, he doesn't need your help. He can take care of himself. So you fellas just give up on that. Don't do that. If he's really a god, let him deal with my son. And out of that comes his new name, which is Let Baal Plead. And for good reason, because the faith of Gideon has stood up to the first test that was thrown against it. So beginning at verse 33, "Then all the Midianites and Amalekites, the people of the east, gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel." Now remember, we've already heard that they'll come over during harvest time. And we know that Gideon was in the process of dealing with the wheat harvest. And so it is harvest time. So here comes this army. And if you look over to chapter 8, you'll learn that it's more than 130,000 men. Boy, you talk about the ground being covered like being covered with locusts. There's no doubt about that. So here they come. Now, verse 34, but the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Then he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, who also gathered behind him. He also sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. So he blows the horn. And why does he blow it? Because the Spirit of the Lord is in him. He is a messenger of God, no doubt about it. And the people respond. Instead of running for the hills, which they've been doing on a regular basis, instead of that, they now gather behind Gideon and they are prepared to go to war. Well, there's a problem, and it's kind of an interesting problem. First of all, it begins with Gideon. Despite everything that's happened, he's still got doubts, and in this, I must say I'm thankful, because I go through spells in my life where I have doubts as well, and it's powerful to see that Gideon has these doubts and that God is willing to listen to the doubts and help him work through them and overcome them. So look, beginning verse 36. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. So, I need to be sure it's you, God. I need to be sure this is what you want me to do. And he lays out the fleece. And of course, the fleece is sopping wet, and apparently the rest of the ground is dry. Well, Gideon's still not quite satisfied. And so, listen again. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. Now, I've got to tell you, right here, when I read this, I'm instantly reminded of Abraham. When God said, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember he would say, if you don't mind, let me ask just one more time, just one more. And he keeps working him down until finally God says, for 10 men, if they're 10 righteous men, I will not destroy the city. Well, here, Gideon says, well, you've already proven it once, but if you would just tolerate me one more time, please do it this way. And it was. God did exactly what he asked him to do. So we now go into chapter 7, and a marvelous thing begins to take place. Notice verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim victory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now, I'll remind all of us that the Midianites have 135,000 approximately men in their army. It's difficult for me to imagine that the Israelites would think that they'd won the victory. We're about to find out how many of them there are. There are some 32,000, and that's it. In other words, about roughly 1/4 the size of the other army. But God says, I want you to know for sure I gave you the victory. I want the people of Israel to know that God delivered them. They've been crying to God. He's going to show that he's answering. And so what does he do? Well, you all remember the story. And it goes further now in the next few verses. Chapter 7 of Judges, verse 3. Now therefore, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So 2/3 of the entire army leave. And now it's 10,000 to about 135,000. 13 and a half to 1 is the number. And God, what does God think? Well, listen. But the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you, and of whomever I say this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. And he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Now, we may be wondering, what is this all about? J.D. Thomas, in his little study of this, quoted from George Adam Smith. Listen to the description that he gives. It's pretty powerful. The stream, which makes it possible for the occupiers of the hill to hold also the well against an enemy on the plain, forbids them to be careless in their use of the water. For they drink in the face of that enemy, and the reeds and shrubs which mark its course afford ample cover for hostile ambushes. Those Israelites, therefore, who bowed themselves down on their knees, drinking headlong, did not appreciate their position or the foe, whereas those who merely crouched, lapping up the water with one hand while they held their weapons in the other and kept their faces to the enemy, were aware of their danger and had their hearts ready against all surprise. Well, that's an interesting explanation. Gideon's going to end up with the best fighters out of the whole bunch under the direction of God, and that's exactly the way that it works. But the numbers are almost astounding, because now we have, of that 10,000, 9,700 are told, you go home too. And all that's left is 300 men in Gideon to go out to the battle. But it's going to work. Why? Because remember, God is fighting for them. So look at verse 6 of chapter 7 of Judges. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. So he's got his army now. But, God already knows. He knows all of us. And he certainly has seen, and we've seen even in this story, that Gideon is a man with some doubts. And so God anticipates, it seems to me, the possible doubt of Gideon. And so in verse 9 of chapter 7 of Judges, we find, it happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I've delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say. And afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outposts, the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites, the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, I've had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it, so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, into whose hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. So it was, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. Now, what we may not realize is that barley bread was not the prime bread in the land of Israel. It wouldn't be here either. Wheat bread is, generally speaking, the prime bread. And so a barley loaf seems insignificant, unimportant, not worth very much. That's not just the image Gideon has of himself, but now he's got an army of just 300 men. They seem insignificant when facing this huge army of about 135,000 men. But God uses a dream about a barley loaf knocking down a tent of Midian and it totally collapsing. And the interpretation of it is Gideon is going to collapse the whole army of the Midianites and everybody that's with them. And with that, he blows the trumpet, or he calls his men together, has them bring their trumpets, and then we discover the story that I suppose most of the children could go ahead and tell us. So here's what he has to say. Then, verse 16, then he divided the 300 men into three camps, or three companies. And he put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Watch. And when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they had posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Now pause just a second. You see what they've done. They've come at the beginning of the middle watch. That's about midnight. It's pitch dark. And you can imagine what this would be like. There are no street lights out there. They haven't hung strings of lights around their camp. No, it's pitch dark out there. Maybe a campfire, but that's about it. And these men have surrounded them. It's only 300, but they're in three companies of 100. And they have trumpets. And boy, you talk about a noise. If 300 trumpets blew all at once, it would sound like, especially coming down, reverberating through those hills and the valleys, it would sound like a massive army. And then they broke their pitchers and held up their torches. And you can just about imagine that we're surrounded. We're surrounded. And that is exactly the sense that God gave those people. And I want us to listen to what happens. Then the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And every man stood in his place all around the camp. And the whole army ran and cried out and fled. When the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. And the army fled to Beth Acacia toward Zerahah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh, and pursued the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize them from the watering places as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan. And all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan. And they captured two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. So the battle is won quickly, and it's really won by God. He throws confusion into the camp, and they actually turn on each other and start killing one another. And the result is that they're destroyed. Gideon calls for help from the Ephraimites. They come and help out with that, but we're about to find out they weren't real happy. And so let's look at chapter 8 and begin with verse 1. Now the men of Ephraim said to him, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites? and they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. I love Gideon for his ability to take this situation and diffuse it so quickly. He says, "Look, you got the better end of the deal. You killed the two kings. You know, you're way out ahead of me in this matter," and they were eased by that. That seemed to satisfy them. Well, Gideon's exhausted troops now cross the Jordan, and let's see what happens. When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian." And the leaders of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" So Gideon said, "For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." Then he went up from there to Penuel, and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, "When I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkar, and their armies with them, about 15,000, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. That's how I keep getting 135,000, because he's got about 15,000 left, they do, and 120,000 have already died. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camp fell secure. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle from the ascent of Heres, and he caught a young man of the men of Succoth and interrogated him. And he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. Then he came to the men of Succoth and said, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary man?' And he took the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness, and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth." I'll say, that'd be some more lesson to be taught. But then he goes on. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. And he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "What kind of men were they who you killed at Tabor?" And they answered, "As you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king." Then he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you." And he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise, kill them." But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength." So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. So a great battle, won by the Lord. They defeated all these people, and they did it because they relied upon God. And that is, to me, one of the most important lessons for us to learn. The world is too busy relying on itself. They make their calculations, they do their tables, and by the way, they keep having to rework the tables, and they come up with all the answers. And the reality is, man doesn't know the answers, then or now. It's always true. God knows the answers. And you and I need to learn from the meeting of God with Gideon at the winepress and the battle that came afterward. And we need to realize, with God on our sides, we can win the victory.